how well will she do come the Holyrood elections in May? Let's discuss all this with the Spectator's Scotland editor, Alex Massey, and Spectator contributor and columnist of the Scottish Daily Mail, Stephen Daisley. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. Alex, let me come to you first. It is right to say, but putting aside the impact that it's having, whether there's much fallout, there's much cut through, that the government, the Scot government, Nicola Sturgeon, they are a little bit beleaguered at the moment.
Yes, I mean, as you rightly suggest, there is a paradox at work here. On the one hand, the SNP continue to register support running at around 50% in all the opinion polls. A level of support that means the outcome of May's Holyrood elections, assuming they go ahead as planned, and the First Minister is very keen that they do, the argument there is, will the SNP win an overall majority, or will they have to make do for what they currently have, which is a very strong minority administration there, where they can often count on support from the Green Party to ensure there is a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. And yet, as you rightly say, there are any number of different arguments on multiple fronts taking place in the SNP at the moment. Some of this is a small number of people who are supporters of Alex Salmond, who feel that he's been stitched up by his successor, and the ongoing fallout from that could yet cause significant difficulties for Nicola Sturgeon. Some of it is about the sort of progressive, or what some people term a woke agenda on gender recognition, transgender rights, and some of it is, yes, well, how are we going to actually force Boris Johnson to hold a referendum on independence that we think he might lose? Why would he do that? What's in it for him? And so all of these things contribute to a situation which is remarkably febrile in Scottish politics, even though the actual outcome of the election in May is pretty much not in doubt. You know, the SNP are going to win. The question is how big they win. But within that, there are any number of discontents and fissures opening, some of which pose short-term problems for Nicola Sturgeon and the Yes movement more generally, some of which could be quite serious in the longer term.
Stephen, is there any sign, even just at the margins, that the problems crowding in on the First Minister are becoming corrosive, or is she totally impervious to it?
Well, I think, as probably came across quite well in Alex's answer there, Nicola Sturgeon is doing great in the polls, and perhaps not so great in the politics behind the polls. In terms of her position, she is in a relatively strong position, given that although she doesn't have a majority at Holyrood, she can rely on the Greens. There is a great deal of support behind her within the institutional party, and much within the parliamentary party. She's also strengthened by the fact that there isn't really an immediate alternative, and those who could potentially replace her are actually people who are of the suitable calibre, I would say, to be able to step into that role. Largely speaking, at least within Holyrood, are those who are sympathetic to her. That is not to say that there aren't problems. There are very much problems. Alex just went through them. I think that there is also a sense that Nicola Sturgeon has talked a very good game on many fronts. She's talked a good game on forcing the UK to allow a second independence referendum. She's talked a good game on COVID. And now we're starting to see it's the rubber hits the road moment, where you see we've transitioned from the kind of the rhetoric to the actual delivery, and whether it's on a second independence referendum or it's on the vaccine rollout, where Scotland is behind all of the other nations of the UK in rolling out the vaccine, you are seeing that the delivery is not matching up to the rhetoric, and so while her politically and institutionally her position is relatively strong just now, you can see the fissure is absolutely opening
up. Alex, the one thing, looking in from the outside, the one thing that is surprising, and did I put it stronger than that, it's kind of jaw-dropping, is that in the inquiry, the Hamilton inquiry, the Irish QC into whether or not Nicola Sturgeon misled the House over Alex Salmond and the process, and then the parliamentary inquiry into broader areas of the Salmond, of the whole salmon business. The amount of information that would normally be in the public realm is not allowed to be put into the public realm. Even the submissions of important figures in the saga, which have been submitted to the Parliament, are not allowed to publish that information. Are people aware in Scotland of how much is being suppressed?
I think, I mean, you may raise a number of excellent points there, Andrew. The short answer to your question is no. There is a widespread feeling that although the political and media class is very interested in the nuts and bolts of this issue, the general public remains fairly indifferent to it. That is partly because there is obviously a sense, I suppose, that the pandemic and its management is a rather greater matter than what happened between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon a number of years ago, and who said what was said at what meeting, etc., etc., etc. All of which becomes very detailed very quickly and very difficult to cut through. There still isn't a sound bite-sized charge against Nicola Sturgeon, save that she has quite possibly, and possibly on multiple occasions, at best misled the Holyrood Parliament and quite possibly lied to it. Whether that would, I mean, traditionally, obviously, that would, if confirmed, if proved, if accepted, would traditionally count as a resignation matter. But Nicola Sturgeon's poll ratings and amongst the public as a whole, not just SNP supporters, and it's important, I think, to stress that, are such that I think quite a lot of people could be persuaded that ordinary circumstances do not apply just now, and that she could conceivably survive a scandal that would have destroyed all her predecessors. But you are absolutely right also to suggest that the way her government has handled this inquiry, having initially promised its full cooperation, has persuaded an awful lot of people, I think, that there must actually be something more to it than meets the eye. Because a government that really had nothing to hide, a First Minister who really was prepared to cooperate with the inquiry to the fullest possible extent, simply wouldn't be behaving like this. So it leads one to think that there is something being covered up. Now, the question then becomes, is it a catalogue of incompetence that is being covered up, or a catalogue of malice that is being covered up, or some mixture of the two in proportions we don't yet know? But it is an excellent example of how not to run these affairs. I think if you are going to have a parliamentary inquiry, and if you are going to take credit for your supposed candour and frankness in establishing an inquiry into yourself, then you really do have to follow through on that and cooperate with it properly. And that clearly has not been the case in this instance.
Stephen, one of the things that does surprise you is if you take some key submissions that this parliamentary inquiry has asked for crucial witnesses, one from Jeff Aberdeen, who was Alex Salmond's chief of staff and was involved in a particularly crucial meeting with Nicola Sturgeon way back in 2018. And I take it to the Alex point that a lot of this is kind of almost Ruritarian in its information, in its complexity. But the point is that this is a submission to a parliamentary inquiry. But the parliamentary inquiry has decided it's unable to publish that evidence. I have been told that Alex Salmond's submission to the public inquiry, that may not be published either. And that indeed he is worried about even testifying before this inquiry in case on some areas he's found to be in contempt of court. I mean, to be honest, you just wouldn't get away with that in Westminster.
I think that is a valid point. It's important to separate out the issues. So one of the issues is, of course, the question of jigsaw identification, which is, I think we all agree, very important.
This is of the women who complained that eventually led to Alex Salmond's trial and the importance of protecting the anonymity of the complainant.
Yes, absolutely. And so a good example of that was the committee has had to slightly drag it out of the Crown Office, but it got access to WhatsApp messages, which it has said that the committee said it won't publish to the general public because it views them as a support group of women who are supporting each other. and that wouldn't be appropriate, obviously, to publish that. There is the issue of jigsaw identification, but if we put that to one side, there is a broader question about how forthcoming the Scottish Government has been willing to be with documents, and how robust the committee has been in attempting to secure some of those productions. And there is a sense that the committee is simply not robust enough, it's not strong enough in itself to force the Scottish Government to produce some of these documents. And that is, I think, one of the unfortunate facts, is that the committee has, although has done some diligent work, and all credit to it for doing that, but there are some who wonder if this is simply a committee that was chosen as the forum for investigating this matter because it would not be able to get to the truth, because it would not be powerful enough to hold the Scottish Government to account.
Well, it's certainly ironic, Alex, that this committee doesn't seem to have the necessary teeth to do a proper inquiry, because, I was in Scotland when the Parliament was set up, and the supporters of devolution, their great boast was our committees are going to have real teeth. We won't have a second chamber in the Scottish Parliament. Instead, we will have committees that will scrutinise legislation before it goes before the House, will hold the politicians to account. And yet here, Alex, you have a situation where you can turn up and testify under oath. It turns out what you said wasn't true. And instead of facing the force of the law for testifying wrongly under oath, you're asked to come back and put the record straight. And if you don't feel like it, you say, I can't be bothered, I'm not coming back. Again, in a major select committee in Westminster, that would just never happen.
That's true. Again, lots of things going on simultaneously. The committee structure at Holyrood is too weak. I think there is a general acceptance of that at Holyrood. It is too weak partly because, as well, these committees are staffed by people who are not themselves particularly capable.
It doesn't have proper legal counsel. It hasn't got a proper legal counsel.
But indeed, they're insufficiently staffed as well and resourced. It is a major institutional failing of the Scottish Parliament and devolution settlement, if you like, at present. There are occasions when committees do some better work. For instance, the Scottish Government's proposed hate crime bill, that is proving extremely controversial as well, has essentially been gutted even before it's been put to the floor of the Parliament. And in part, that is because of the work of the Justice Committee that has been analysing it. But overall, yes, you have a problem in Scotland of an overmighty executive and an enfeebled legislature, and that is then perhaps also combined with, as you know well from your own experience, an enfeebled Scottish press that lacks the resources sometimes to cover Parliament properly, and a broadcast media in Scotland that is also much diminished compared to where it was a generation ago in terms of the scrutiny it is prepared to apply to whoever happens to be in power in Edinburgh. And at the moment, obviously, that is the SNP, and they've been in power for 14 years, which, I think one can make a plausible argument is long enough. And you see, not whether one agrees with the SNP or not per se, simply that after 14 years in government, if you have not achieved your initial objectives, it's extremely unlikely that you are going to. And all governments run out of steam of ideas and the ability, the capacity to reinvent themselves. And I think we're seeing a lot of that with Nicola Sturgeon's government at the moment as well, which accounts for some of the sort of frustration and this sort of curious sense, again, as we were saying at the beginning, where on the one hand, Scottish politics is extremely stable. The SNP first, everyone else nowhere, and yet within that, there is an enormous amount of strife and instability inside the SNP and more generally in Scottish politics. It is, if you like, a sort of Caledonian antisyzygy of our times.
Yes, indeed. Stephen, crucial documents that should be in the public domain being massively redacted, crucial submissions to a public inquiry not being published, the Crown Office seemingly using jigsaw identification in the broadest possible interpretation, in ways that sometimes defy logic, to close down information becoming public that they don't want to become public. If that was happening in London, I couldn't see the London press, London media putting up with this. Is the Scottish media just too supine?
Well, I think that there is, first of all, Alex identified some of the important structural issues. Scotland is obviously, it's a smaller country. We have, if I say even proportionally, we probably have less in the way of a media landscape. You could argue the media is less adversarial. I'm talking about broadcast media here. There is less of a there is no sort of Robert Peston or Laura Kuenssberg sort of figure who is is seen as a thorn in the side of the government of the day, whoever that is. And also, there is the point, as I say, as Alex makes, that the Scottish media just lacks a lot of the resources. It's not. I know some people think there's some conspiracy that the Scottish press doesn't want to investigate the SNP. That it is much more the fact that there is just not the same bodies on the ground that there once were. And yourself from that the Scottish press was once prided itself on its robustness and having armies of reporters it could send in. Not so much now. I think this is probably shown up the real trouble you get into when you don't have a robust, well-staffed, well-funded adversarial media, where you have a government that is in trouble on all sorts of fronts, and yet on what is as you say, if this were happening in Westminster, this would be not only would be national news, I argue would be international news. That is not happening, and in Scotland it is, as Alex and you've also alluded to, it's barely cutting through with people. So I think this does show what happens when you don't have a robust media, and that is I think that highlights the problem, that we have several democratic flaws in Scotland. The Parliament is too weak, the press is too weak, and the government is not held to account enough.
Let me just finish on the post-election politics, talking with Alex, and then I'll come back to you, Stephen. Let's assume that Nicola Sturgeon wins. That's not a dangerous assumption. Maybe she doesn't get quite that overall majority, but she's still clearly the winner of the election and clearly the next First Minister. Does she, do you think, Alex, does she have a plan in her mind, a strategy over what to do about a second referendum?
No is the simple answer to that. I mean, the argument will be that she has the moral authority to press for a second independence referendum, that Brexit is the kind of change in circumstance that justifies revisiting the national question 6, 7, 8 years after it was notionally decided in 2014. And even if you're opposed to the SNP's plans, I think one has to accept that there is a certain moral force to that argument. Against that, however, it is only 6, 7, 8 years since there was a referendum, and it is also, I think, morally plausible and morally just to argue that it is too soon to reopen that question, because referendums have to have meaning, and that means the results have to be given meaning. Otherwise, you're into the never-ending world, which is of little use to most people. And so you have a collision between plausible arguments, it seems to me. And in the absence of consensus that there should be a referendum on independence, and that consensus, remember, existed in 2012, which allowed the 2014 referendum to take place. In the absence of that consensus, it seems to me that it is very difficult to proceed with one, even if you have the legal right to do so, even if the courts confirm that you could, because it has to be a gold standard referendum, to use the SNP's own phrase, and that means replicating most of the conditions that applied in 2014. And as I say, I think that one of the chief ones of those is the consent of those who do not want independence. The unionists, if unionists agreed that there should be a referendum, there would be no problem. But we all have to live in the Scotland that happens after it, and so therefore the referendum itself, I think, has to take place at a time when there is widespread acceptance and agreement that it is a suitable moment for it. And we are still some way off that. You know, the just say no approach, which the Prime Minister is duty bound to follow, is clearly subject to the laws of diminishing returns. Because every year that you move away from 2014 is a year closer to a time when it might be okay to revisit the question. But for the time being, it seems to me there is just enough juice remaining to be extracted from that position. And there is frankly very little, I think, that Nicola Sturgeon can do about that, and concocting plans B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to Z if necessary, so doesn't actually change that fundamental dynamic, which is that there isn't at present a way for her to force the referendum. And so we are then stuck in a kind of waiting pattern in which nationalists, rather like Mr. McCorber, are waiting for something to turn up that will bring them the referendum, and unionists, for their part, are waiting for something to turn up that will either shoot the referendum fox, or, if there is a referendum, cause the nationalists to lose it. And so we're again in this sort of febrile state in Scottish politics, where everything is possible, but nothing ever changes.
All right. Final brief thought on this from you, Stephen, before we move on.
Well, I think that I would largely agree that there is very little Nicola Sturgeon can do. The SNP has come out with this so-called roadmap to a referendum, and the proposition in this is that they will just simply, if they win a majority in May, they'll bring forward a referendum and essentially dare the UK government to try and stop them in the courts if they feel they can. I think that's more about ginning up the national space ahead of the election. There's very little leeway here for the SNP. The Constitution is reserved, and if Boris Johnson doesn't want to give a referendum, if the UK Parliament doesn't want to give one, it doesn't have to give one.
All right, gentlemen, plenty to keep you busy north of the border. Thank you for your time today, for joining us here on Spectator TV. We now turn to our final segment for this week. The pandemic has been tough for many institutions.